the Russian Empire wanted to have more of a buffer zone between kind of the Swedish Empire and their capital city.
And Finland has always had that kind of liminal status of being positioned between
Neutral.
big power blocks.
They're a neutral power.
And
also a long history of kind of conflict with Russia and Sweden, as well as being part of the Swedish Empire for a while as well. Finland made some attempts to establish a mutual kind of military agreement with Sweden.
Interesting kind of echo of the colonial interest.
Yeah. So continuation war lasted from obviously 1941. A few days after the Germans declared war on the Soviet Union, broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
So it's kind of the turbocharged version of the Winter War with the Germans on side.
The Soviets kind of recognized that it would be an impossible sort of task to try and occupy Finland. I'll tell you a bit more about how they became neutral and kind of the way that panned out for them. Welcome to episode 2 of the Echo Changer podcast with myself, Jacob.
And myself, Harley.
So yeah, we're going to start getting into the bones of it now.
The meat.
Really start talking about some topics and getting into something interesting. So for this first kind of proper episode, we're going to be looking more closely into, the next couple of episodes rather, we're going to be looking more closely into World War II and the kind of perceptions of World War II from different angles. We're often kind of taught, especially in countries like the UK or the US, we're kind of taught the basic kind of aspects of World War II, kind of the Allies and the Axis, and the kind of the way the war played out between the major powers. However, there are a lot of different perspectives on World War II that we're not really ever taught about,
and hidden sides to it as well. I think certainly that I'll be going into, but I think a little bit you as well. Elements that you just wouldn't even in a million years put two and two together to think might be the case. So
and I think also the other thing is that a lot of history around World War II is seen as very black and white. I definitely think it's never that, like, history is never that simple. No. There's always nuance to be found,
and it has to be black and white, right? In terms of the kind of mythologizing of history, in that say especially with the Second World War, it is so central, especially as Brits, it is so central to our sort of island story that we have to kind of simplify things a little bit, and in the course of telling that story, we maybe omit certain things,
but also in just the sense of it being a source of national pride, victories and wars have been sources of national pride and identity for thousands of years. That's never changed. So you always kind of want to frame military victories and things as like real sort of things to focus in on, and obviously then that's where the narrative of things that maybe didn't go to plan, or perspectives that don't necessarily fit that view, that might then become a bit problematic from that perspective. So in terms of World War II, I mean, obviously, we're going to hone in on a few different topics, but today I really want to talk about kind of one of the slightly lesser known stories in the UK at least, which is the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union, which obviously occurred in 1939, just as the war was kind of kicking off in Europe. Obviously, we can talk for hours about the kind of the build up of World War II and kind of the events and everything.
We'll spare our listeners the full AJP Taylor on that one.
But essentially, Finland had a very complex involvement in World War II due to the fact that they fought alongside the Axis, and we can obviously look at World War II and think, okay, these are the list of countries that were in the Axis powers, this is the list of the countries that were in the Allies, and we can view that as very much these are the good guys, these are bad guys.
But also in terms of the permanence of those roles, I think we sometimes
it's black and white.
We don't often look at how alliances shift as a conflict,
and also, but also the
changes,
the motivations behind the different countries as well, because Germany's intentions were very clear from the start in the way that they operated, the way that they their foreign
they
policy.
Weren't hiding their light under a bushel.
No, they really weren't. And same with Italy. Italy obviously had this kind of weird identity crisis as a nation of them wanting to kind of regain former glories, wanted to be that major power again, but obviously they were kind of just like little broed by.
But they'd also,
Germany
yeah, exactly. But they had also had that kind of. I mean, in the First World War, you had that slight uncertainty about whose side are we on, what are we doing, what are our
which coincided a lot with the fall of empires and a lot of geopolitical turmoil in that sense as well.
Italy's always been a little bit more uncertain of itself on the world stage in terms of the world wars, certainly.
Yeah. But obviously, I mean, go back to kind of the Winter War. Because like I mentioned, Finland had a bit more of a complex history with the world wars. Obviously, Finland itself was independent at the time of World War II breaking out. However, it had most recently been a part of the Russian Empire under the Tsar, and then also
that's something I didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, obviously people forget that Sweden was an empire once upon a time.
Yeah, could never have told you that there was such a thing as the Swedish Empire.
We can absolutely dive into that in a future episode. But yeah, the most recent history of Finland before the war was World War II at least, and World War One was that Finland was part of the Russian Empire. They were kind of included in the Russian Empire following a conflict between the Russian Empire and the Swedish Empire.
Okay.
And there's kind of a long-standing,
and that's a 19th century conflict.
Yes, yeah. So there's kind of I'll get to it a bit later on, but there is a bit of a context, kind of the border conflict and disputes between Finland and Russia, which in some ways are parallel to kind of Ukraine and Russia at the moment, and even Finland and Russia at the moment, with Finland obviously joining NATO in the last couple of years. So yeah, just
Finland has always had that kind of liminal status of being kind of positioned between
neutral.
Big power blocks.
They're a neutral power.
And we're seeing that now, and we're seeing it.
But I'm going to sort of tell you a bit more about how they became neutral and kind of the way that panned out for them. So yeah, just a little bit of a background on the Winter War for obviously anyone who doesn't know what happened, or kind of the context behind it. Sort of in the build up to World War II in the 1930s, there was a bit of a kind of uneasy peace between Finland and Russia, following obviously the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The Bolshevik government actually supported independence movements in some of the former sort of empire countries.
I suppose as a way of breaking up the Tsar.
Yeah, because it sort of added obviously to chaos of the Russian Revolution and the Civil War and everything. But there was support for obviously an independent state of Finland, naturally under a communist government, as they were kind of aligning that themselves. However, because of kind of Finland's recent history of kind of building independence movements, there being quite a lot of sort of ethnic group tension in the sense that obviously the more kind of Finnic peoples, or I think the exact term was like Finnic Ugric. Also,
okay, yeah, that rings a bell.
Finnic Ugric or something like that, along those kind of lines. So it was obviously there was lots of different regions that were in Finland that were kind of had the different native people that maybe had tension with the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, and Russia's main motivation behind kind of with Finland was that they wanted to have a buffer zone between St. Petersburg, or as it was known, Leningrad back then, which Leningrad was St. Petersburg was the original capital of Russia during the empire.
Sort of very Europe-facing, very cosmopolitan. Moscow being much more Rousseau-centric.
Yeah. But obviously, even in this sort of border dispute dates all the way back to the Russian Empire, because obviously the Finnish border is very close. And then obviously following the independence of Finland, there were kind of lots of different border disputes, whether that was, the Soviet Union wanted to have more of a buffer zone between Leningrad, renamed, and Finland, because they feared that Finland would use their country as a staging ground for other powers to attack Russia. Which is also the basis of kind of like their distrust of Finland in the Second World War, but also just they wanted to kind of minimize the threat of Finland on their borders, and also they had a policy of expansion. As soon as the Soviet Union was kind of established as a country following the Civil War, they wanted to Stalin especially wanted to reclaim kind of the territories that were under the rule of Tsarist Russia, just to sort of maintain that sphere of influence, keep the, essentially have an empire still, and sort of bring those countries to heel. So Finland had an official non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, which was signed in about 1934, where there was kind of a mutual agreement that obviously when Finland became independent, they would be neutral. They wouldn't join any other factions, or they wouldn't really kind of ally with other countries against Russia in exchange for keeping their independence. They ceded a little bit of territory, but obviously the sort of intent was that they were going to be a neutral power. And the Finns agreed to that on the basis that obviously they wouldn't get invaded by the Russians, they wouldn't have to, give any more territorial concessions, and they'd be able to kind of just do their own thing rather than having to be a vassal state of the Soviet Union. However, this relationship got a bit more strained after a few more years in the build-up to World War II, as there was then kind of more of a feeling in the Soviet Union that they wanted to have that re-establish the buffer zone that they gained before. So that that was contrary to sort of more nationalist movements in Finland that were envisioning a greater state of Finland.
Yeah. And then, the 19th century is the moment of nationalisms all across Europe. So they're like everybody else, they are asserting their identity. I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine the Finnish language was probably focused on, to a large extent, as part of that broader kind of nationalist project. They probably would have been speaking Russian, I would imagine, or possibly Swedish as well at one point.
Well, it's interesting because the kind of background on Finland's history in following on from the conflict between the Swedish Empire and the Russian Empire was that Finland was obviously incorporated into the Russian Empire. However, they still maintained a large amount of kind of their cultural identity, and their kind of, their national spirits and stuff like that. And there was a campaign under the Tsar to Russify all of the sort of the territories that they controlled. But these efforts were incredibly resisted in Finland, and the policy of Russification actually didn't really get to take off in Finland. They it was almost cancelled due to the turmoil that was happening in the Russian Empire at the time leading up to the Civil War.
Yeah, they could only fight on so many.
Exactly. So there was a lot of resistance to that, and as a result,
we'll let the Finns get on with it. Do that thing. It's not too much of a problem.
So essentially, the Finns were able to retain their national identity. They were able to retain large amounts of their native population, their language. They never sort of had the same Russification that other sort of territories might have had. But then just the fact that they tried to Russify Finland generated such a massive amount of anti-Russian sentiment in Finland, that they were determined to kind of never be in that position again. So that's kind of the background in terms of the build-up. Obviously, we then bring it back to World War II, where you obviously had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Soviet Union and Germany, which is kind of always seen as the catalyst for the start of the war, and the start of obviously the Nazis sort of starting their conquest of different countries.
And Poland being the kind of the sort of the pot in which all of this stuff is being stirred.
The battleground, unfortunately, for Poland. But the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact wasn't just a non-aggression pact between Russia and Germany. It was a kind of acknowledgement of spheres of influence. So obviously, the Germans wanted to have complete dominance over Western Europe and Central Europe. Obviously splitting kind of a little bit of influence with Italy, but they didn't really give anything to Italy. But the main thing is they wanted to have kind of unchecked control of Western Europe, whereas they recognized that the Soviet Union obviously had a lot of former territories or claims to different lands in Eastern Europe and Northern Europe, and they kind of signed a mutual, almost like, we're not going to mess with you. You do your thing, we'll do our thing. We'll just not intervene with each other's business. And obviously,
which didn't last very long.
Which didn't last very long, as it turns out. But also that's a follow-on from the Winter War. So obviously, Finland fell within and the Baltic states also fell within the Soviet sphere of influence. The Baltic states were given a series of ultimatums where there were kind of demands to have Soviet military bases or do training operations in their countries, which then essentially just turned into an occupation. And they weren't really able to resist that because they didn't really have substantial militaries that could defeat the Red Army or any of the political will to kind of put themselves under that it was easier to kind of just be like, there's no point in us.
Well, and also in this developing conflict, they probably looked over to what Nazi Germany was doing, and they thought, oh, maybe we'll sort of hedge our bets and just
live and let live.
Kind of, yeah. Maybe the Russians aren't so bad. I mean, maybe let's not make a rod for our back. Let's just get on with it.
Yeah,
be sort of pragmatic at the moment.
But obviously, so that was kind of the Baltics, which we'll cover them in another episode at some stage, because it's very interesting history around the Baltic states and the wars. But going back to Finland, obviously then this kind of then coincided with sort of rising tensions between Finland and Russia, where obviously Russia is on this kind of spree of giving people ultimatums and taking them again, and annexing different places. And they then wanted to reestablish that buffer zone. So the kind of official, I feel like this is also framed as, the Soviets sent an ultimatum to Finland and they just declared war. That was it. But there was a series of quite lengthy negotiations where the Soviet side actually was apparently quite friendly towards the Finns. They were quite diplomatic in terms of like trying to have compromise with the Finns. They essentially wanted to reestablish the buffer zone from that they had between Leningrad and Finland. They wanted to have access. Well, they wanted Finland to cede a number of islands on the kind of lead up to Leningrad, so that they could establish defenses. They wanted Finland to lease them an island to build a military base on for about 30 years. And then they also wanted to kind of have a commitment of neutrality from the Finns as well as ceding a little bit more territory. But then on the other end of the spectrum, they would obviously allow Finland to be independent. They would also give back some land in different areas to Finland. However, naturally, as you would as a formerly occupied country by that country, the Finns did not trust them, which was the smart idea, to be honest.
Well, this is sounding a little bit similar to something I'm going to get onto, which is the relationship between Ireland and Great Britain in the war, and the similar kind of thing. Ex-colonial overlords saying, hey guys, can you sort of help us out? And them saying, oh, well, we don't really like you all that much, and yada, yada, yada. But anyway, an interesting parallel. But
yeah, no, for sure. But yeah, also obviously the Finns didn't trust the Soviets at all. They were sort of afraid that if they, the Soviets were going to take a similar kind of negotiating turn to the Germans, in the sense that they would, issue a series of demands that might be negotiated and accepted, but then immediately after that there'd be more concessions that would need to be made to avoid a war or conflict or something. And the Finns were very kind of concerned with sort of ceding their position and kind of weakening their ability to defend themselves against the Soviets if there was ever another war. So the negotiations eventually broke down. The Soviets declared war. They just needed to establish what they wanted with force. And this is where we kind of get into maybe the more well-known part of the Winter War, is that obviously Finland had a vastly smaller army than the Red Army. They also didn't have as much kind of modern equipment. Finland made some attempts to establish a mutual kind of military agreement with Sweden in the immediate run up to the war, which
interesting kind of echo of the colonial interest.
Which was entirely unsuccessful, as Sweden was entirely committed to their policy of neutrality, which they established well before.
How does one neutral power relate itself to another neutral power? It's an interesting question.
It's more kind of, I guess, neutral countries that are committed to being neutral agree to defend each other if anyone violates that neutrality, I guess, but in the same way. But Sweden was also very wary that both the Germans and the Soviets had interests in their region, and they didn't want to get involved, for fair reason, to be fair. But yeah, so
you don't know what kind of worms you're going to open if you suddenly stick an oar in. So
exactly,
to mix my metaphor.
Yeah, but yeah, so they petitioned the Swedes, they petitioned the UK, the Allies, but it was all fairly unsuccessful. They couldn't get that guarantee of independence. that they were seeking. So in the end, the Soviets declared war on the Finns. They fought the Winter War, which actually only lasted about 3 months. However, in that time, obviously the Soviets vastly outnumbered the Finnish army. And the sort of rate of casualties, I think the Finns took around, it was about 25,000 casualties in this war, compared to 160,000 or so on the Soviet side. So obviously quite a mismatch.
Well, it's a question of scale as well, isn't it? And
Yeah.
the size of armies and all that.
But the main kind of driver of that was that the Soviet, or the Red Army at the time, they had very poor organization. Their military command wasn't very experienced. They made a lot of errors in the invasion of Finland. They didn't really think through the terrain. They didn't think through their enemy. Finland obviously employed lots of kind of guerrilla warfare tactics.
And then I think, is that what the film Sisu that was recently out, is that what that kind of focuses on? Because I've been meaning to watch that because it looks like a great kind of Tarantino-esque kind of look at the Finnish story.
That's probably the theme. I haven't watched it myself, but I also maybe that's we need to watch it together.
Do a little review maybe.
Yeah. But yeah, so obviously the Finns displayed massive heroism, courage, being able to defend themselves in the face of a vastly more powerful enemy. However, eventually the Soviets reorganized their sort of military structure. They brought in more experienced generals. They changed their tactics, and then naturally they broke the line and forced a sort of surrender or a white peace. So yeah, the Soviets broke through the Finnish line after about 3 months of fighting, and that resulted in a sort of an armistice agreement.
The tongue twister.
Yeah. Where again, the results of this were also quite interesting, because usually you would kind of think that that would mean, Finland surrenders, they would be annexed by the Soviet Union, or there'd be a puppet government installed, and that would kind of be the end of it. But I think the Soviets kind of recognized that it would be an impossible sort of task to try and occupy Finland, given the situation that they had. Also, the fact that there wasn't an entirely total military defeat. They didn't conquer the entire country. There was kind of a mutual agreement that they would just stop and end it there. Obviously, the Finns had to make quite a lot of concessions. They needed to cede the land that the Soviets requested. And then also to recommit that policy of neutrality and to not get involved in any of kind of
the big sort of reset.
The war. Yeah, so it's almost a reset in that sense. So obviously the borders were reset they were reset back to the Tsarist Russian borders, where they obviously have that buffer zone. They took the islands that they wanted. They had all the kind of they took some other territory as well. I think.
Was it quite punitive from the Russian side over to the Finnish side, or was it quite kind of, let's just forget that ever happened and we'll sort of start again?
Well, I think there was obviously the ultimate impact was that they obviously had to give up about, I think it was about 9% of their territory.
Right, hence the shifting back to the Tsarist lines.
And obviously that caused tension as well. But they did give them fairly favourable terms in the sense that they didn't impose massive war reparations on them. They didn't disarm their country or anything like that. But obviously that was on the basis of that they would be neutral in the conflict. So obviously then that kind of came to a conclusion in early 1940. Obviously 3 months after the war started.
That's a lot to pack into 3 months.
It's a lot to pack into 3 months. But obviously, the ramification of this was that it was a massively humiliating kind of defeat. Well, not defeat, but it was a massively humiliating kind of ordeal for the Russians. Yes. Their international reputation suffered. Yeah. The perception of the Red Army as a legitimate fighting force was also questioned, which also emboldened Hitler to actually believe that they could beat the Red Army fairly easily, which you could argue if the Winter War had gone a different way and it was a more decisive victory for the Soviet Union, that the Germans would have actually delayed Barbarossa,
because they would have said, "Oh, hang on, these guys are serious.
They look competent. We wouldn't be able to meet them straight on. It would be a real slog." As we obviously know, it didn't turn out that way. Regardless of what the Germans would have done, they would have lost.
And maybe good to precipitate that sooner rather than later and just get the Germans bogged down really early on.
Yeah.
Although obviously there's some spectacular victories at the start.
But obviously, it completely, shattered this idea that the Soviet Union would be a strong military force in the sense of rivaling Germany or the Allies. And then conversely, on the other foot, then the opinion of Finland was massively increased. They were really seen as this kind of, even in defeat, they were still seen as this kind of heroic entity of resisting a larger oppressing force. And coming out of it with their kind of dignity mostly intact, at least, even after making some concessions. But then this takes us to a few years later. So obviously, the Winter War was the start of this kind of moving of borders, and shifting tides of politics and geopolitics in Europe. The Germans continued with their kind of conquest of Poland, France, the Benelux region, and kind of dominating Western Europe. And the Soviets obviously annexed the Baltic states. They took their share of Poland, and they kind of maintained control over those kind of things and were still building up their industry. However, in 1941, the Germans obviously declared war on the Soviet Union. And 3 days or 4 days after that, the Finns then declared war on the Soviet Union in the Continuation War.
Again, never heard of it.
So obviously, the Continuation War, naturally, as you would assume, the Finns were not very happy that they had to give up 9% of their land. They also lost, I think, their second biggest city as well in that land as well. So,
and what is that? What is their second?
I'm not entirely sure.
Presumably Helsinki being the first.
Because I'm not entirely sure the name of the city, but it's in that region between kind of like the Russian border and the Finnish border, like in that middle zone.
But that's a huge population zone to just suddenly lose.
Yeah, and obviously the other thing was that like a lot of the people who obviously the Finns who lived in that city moved to other parts of Finland. They didn't become part of Russia.
Well, this is sounding awfully familiar again to bring it back to the present day of the early phases of the Russia-Ukraine war and the questions around Donetsk and the kind of how Russian are some of these how Russian are some of these populations. Do they want to be taken back? Do they not? All this kind of stuff. So,
but then we also go back to the kind of policy of Russification that lots of countries underwent under the Russian Empire, and how legitimate is it when you move out a bunch of natives and then move your own people in. Just to transform the region. I mean, I guess that's another question for a different conversation. But obviously, this is where we get into the real kind of the meat of the topic, really, because obviously we have this perception that the Finns joined the Axis. They were fighting with the Germans. They did fight alongside the Germans. But the Continuation War was the result of them kind of seeing the opportunity to reclaim their stolen territory along with more.
It's a continuation,
So to kind of reiterate that they really they did believe in that kind of image of greater Finland that they had, and they felt that it was more achievable as soon as the Germans invaded the Soviets. So officially, the Finns allowed the Germans to station German soldiers in their country, in their territory. They also attacked from Finland as well. So the Finns, I think they aided in the siege of Leningrad, or kind of the encirclement of Leningrad during the war. Obviously, they never actually took the city, but that's kind of another section of the war.
So interesting that the Germans are taking the Finns under their wing, and yet they are still getting massively bogged down in Russia, and they're unable to, or is this in that early part where we are seeing those spectacular victories by the Germans?
Well, the original
and is that why? I mean, is it because they have help from the Finns in this? Is that?
Well, there are a number of different reasons as to why the German invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't successful. Initially, they saw a lot of success because they obviously had the blitzkrieg tactics that worked so well in Western Europe, and obviously when they capitulated other nations insanely quickly. But with the sheer scale of Russia, as we see from other parts of history, like Napoleon, also.
Well, it's the old maxim that Monty was keen on: never invade Russia or China.
Yeah.
It's not gonna,
But it's also, I think the system that they had, the military system of blitzkrieg, was that it was really just based on logistics, and obviously the armored kind of corps would proceed. They'd go first. They'd break through the enemy line at blazing speed, and create these in massive encirclements that then the infantry and the supply lines would then follow them through the gap, resulting in massive encirclements of Soviet soldiers in lots of different cities around on their way to kind of Moscow. However, it works in short distances, but then as soon as they reached any of the big cities in Russia, say like Stalingrad or Leningrad, Moscow, they met massive amounts of resistance. And when they were, as if the blitzkrieg only works if they're able to secure tactical victories along the way. If they can't establish those encirclements and they can't establish the supply lines, they can be encircled themselves, they can be broken down by running out of fuel, they can run out of ammo and things like that as well. So there's a lot of different factors that led to the...
Well, Napoleon had a lot of these problems as well.
Exactly.
Coming up against.
So on the paper, they maybe could have gone further, they could have gone faster, but in reality it was a lot harder for them to do that over a long distance.
They were quite good at things on paper, the Germans. They're very efficient. They could say, "Oh, we'll need this many troops, and we'll go da da da." But maybe something they lack is the sort of just the real sense of the kind of lived experience of what is this actually going to look like? Are the weather conditions? Are we really going to be able to conquer those weather conditions? Because those are some severe, especially if you go into the winter.
Well, also the real goal for the Germans was to capture obviously the Caucasus oil fields, to sort of secure their supplies of fuel, because their military was so heavily dependent on tanks and armor.
And the further away you get from home, the harder it is.
It's hard to supply. So that was one of the contributing reasons to why Germany didn't win in Russia. But obviously, going back to Finland again. Finland actually.
Can I stop you there just to say, because our listeners might be wondering, and I'm certainly wondering, what date are we looking at now? Where you currently are in the story? What?
So continuation war lasted from obviously 1941. A few days after the Germans declared war on the Soviet Union, broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
I see. Okay.
But this lasted all the way to 1944, when the Russians started pushing.
It's a serious continuation.
So this because obviously that war went on for a long time. It wasn't a few months. Like the German invasion of the Soviet Union lasted until the late stages.
So it's kind of the turbocharged version of the Winter War with the Germans on side.
Yeah.
Kind of the revenge of the Finns plus.
But so obviously Finland, they did actually regain. Well, they regained all of the territory that they lost in the armistice agreements, plus more land as well that they secured. So they actually increased their borders and controlled more land than they were originally asking for. And obviously, as soon as the Germans started getting pushed back, this is where things start getting tricky, because obviously the Finns fought alongside the Germans. They offered, access to their country. They offered access to supply troops there and attack from their country. And they fought alongside them in every kind of aspect in that sense. However, where the line kind of gets a bit blurry is where we think, okay, any country that's in the Axis was kind of actively collaborating with the Germans in everything that they did. Yeah. The Finns had a relatively small Jewish population during the war. The number escapes me, but I'm fairly sure it's a few thousand. I think not too many.
And that would probably be the Pale of Settlement in the Tsarist period. The policies of various Tsars of pushing the Jews out towards Eastern Europe and the sort of Baltic regions. They would have spread out, and a few of them, as you say, would have ended up kind of up in Finland. Yeah,
and essentially, there were obviously the Nazis requested for the Finns to send Jews to concentration camps in Poland and Eastern Europe. And the Finns refused. They refused on every account. I think there was maybe one instance where I think they had to try it. They had to send 10 people, but only one person actually ended up in kind of in a camp.
Oh, so a little bit like on our end of things. I think we had one Jewish victim of the Holocaust on Alderney, in the Channel Islands, which the Germans famously occupied. So both us and the Finns, we managed to only have one casualty in that regard.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part that people maybe don't know is that Finland actually refused to take part in in hostility in other parts of Europe as part of the Axis. They sort of, as a condition of them obviously allowing Germany to use their land as a staging ground, and for the Finns to aid them in invading the Soviet Union.
So you wouldn't have seen any sort of Einsatzgruppe and no sort of death squads that made their way up into Finland. And
I mean, there may have been that tried to do.
It sounds like there weren't. If only one Jew was.
I mean, they famously refused Himmler his request to send Jews to concentration camps by stating, "We don't have a Jewish solution. There's
no Jewish problem.
There's no Jewish
therefore,
problem.
there is no need for a final solution.
No need for that. And then Germany at that point wasn't really in any position
speaking Himmler's language back to him. Yeah.
Yeah. So they did refuse in that case, and they also sort of said like our involvement in this is purely for our own aims.
Well, like a lot of things, my enemy's enemy is my friend. It's always comes out as that.
So it was very much that kind of relationship, and then obviously then we get to the point where the USSR pushes the Germans back, and then this is obviously the first domino that starts to lead to the end of the war in Europe and the Germans falling eventually. But as soon as the Germans were pushed back past Leningrad, and obviously the Russian army had then gone into Finland and started to take more land. There was then another peace agreement between Finland and the Soviet Union, which then enforced kind of harsher peace terms. So obviously then they had to
fool us once, that kind of thing.
So they then obviously had to cede the land that they had ceded in the last peace agreement, plus more regions in northern Finland they had to give over to the Soviet Union. There was also war reparations. That were
more swinging terms the second time around.
And then again enforced kind of neutrality.
I suppose they thought, well, you didn't seem to learn the lesson the first time, so we're going to really hurt you now.
Yeah, but surprisingly, they still kept their majority independence. There was no kind of puppet government installed.
Maybe the Soviets at that point kind of realized this is a very kind of nationalistic, proud population, and it's going to be a really tough one to a bit like, again, if we bring it forward, I think Putin maybe misunderestimated, but that's a George Bushism. Underestimated the extent to which the Ukrainians would not just roll over and would not see themselves as he saw them, i.e. part of the greater Russian Empire. This kind of in this broad sort of Peter the Great kind of vision he has of all of that. So an interesting parallel.
Yeah, and I think obviously, just to give a bit of context on the timeline. So obviously now we're into 1944. So the war in itself is not over. World War II is still raging across the world, but this conflict in this very specific theatre was ending due to the agreement between Finland and the Soviet Union. Where obviously there were all these concessions, lots of things that the Finns had to give up in exchange for their independence. And then obviously when we kind of the most interesting kind of aspect of this peace deal was that the Finns were then instructed at this point to expel any German forces, any German infrastructure or fighting capability from their land. And obviously officially Finland was part of the Axis at this stage. So this then interestingly led to a conflict between Germany and Finland, where obviously the Finns demanded that the Germans leave their territory as this, we're neutral again now. Yeah. We've been well and truly we're done now, guys. We're finished.
We done been told. Yeah.
So they obviously then demanded that they issued the ultimatum that they need to leave. The Germans refused and sort of wanted to continue the fight.
So they got more heart for it than the Russians do at this point. They still want to keep a foothold in
Well, the thing is, it's a strategic position because even as they were getting pushed back in mainland Europe, they could then have that avenue to attack.
Probably some useful oil fields as well, I would think.
Maybe a few, but nothing substantial. It was
so the Finns aren't kind of resource rich, or
not in the sense that not to the degree that the Germans would have needed to really gain the foothold that they needed to push back, and also
at this point they're already rolling back anyway.
By this stage, you've got D-Day's pretty imminent, or it's already happened.
They've got bigger problems on the other side.
Their days are well and truly numbered by this point. But obviously, yeah, the Finns fought the Germans too, and to try and expel their forces. By this point, Germany didn't really. They put up a bit of a fight, but eventually, with the aid of some Soviet help as well, they were able to expel the Germans from Finland entirely, which then resulted in kind of, obviously that's the end of Finland's war, pretty much.
That's interesting. Okay, so probably a good moment then to jump in with, because you had been telling me in some of the stuff you were looking at around some of the other Baltic nations about the issues of, if you're a kind of ethnic minority in one of these countries, and the borders keep changing and different people are in power, do a lot of kind of ethnic Finns end up in the gulag? Is that kind of happening, or is it not so much? Because that obviously happens in some of the other Baltic states further down, but you can tell me maybe a little bit about what have you come across on that front.
I mean, from what I've seen, I don't think that happened on anywhere near the same scale or degree as with other countries.
Well, maybe did the Russians maybe see them as more ethnically Russian because of the proximity?
Not necessarily, because Finland. I mean, the easiest way to kind of illustrate this is that you look at, say, like we talk about Scandinavia, right? We look at Scandinavian countries, so you always think of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, even as well. Finland is included within that. But culturally, Finland, in terms of language, in terms of like their actual culture, they're way different. It's the same with the Baltic states. You have obviously maybe some cultural similarities between Lithuania and Latvia, but then Estonia is more close to Finland than the other two. And again, that's where we go back to this kind of notion that Greater Finland that they were looking to establish, where they would have kind of their ethnic group would have that kind of region in all the regions that they lived in as one big country. So I guess that's kind of the context to that. I mean, interesting is another interesting point was that there was actually a little civil war in Finland following the independence declaration, again between whites and reds, and obviously like the more democratic faction against the communist faction.
So very much mirroring the Russian Civil War in that regard.
And the Bolsheviks supported obviously the communist sort of faction, which eventually lost because some of the white Russian forces tried to help the white side of the Finns, which were eventually triumphant. But then the red Finns who then went into Russia were eventually, I think, executed by the Bolsheviks, which then caused even more bad blood between the Finns and the Russians, because even there was sort of like, we didn't like those guys, but you didn't need to kill them because they were from Finland. Like, that's a bit
also they're kind of coming to you saying, brothers, comrades, we're all of the same thing, and they go, no, you're not.
It's kind of like, you're useless. You haven't served your purpose here, so that's that. So there's interesting kind of nuances in that part as well. So I mean that's kind of a brief history of that. But to take it back to the current day, you obviously have the parallel of Finland was neutral throughout most of the 20th century, but then that policy of neutrality was completely rewritten when they joined NATO a couple of years ago, obviously following the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and that policy shift is very interesting because first of all, it changes for Sweden as well, about 150 years of neutrality on all accounts, but also Finland's military has also been put under the spotlight because Finnish kind of military doctrine and their kind of tactics is all geared towards defending an attack from Russia, because that's what they've been expecting and that's what they've been preparing for. So the whole notion of kind of, obviously the parallel between World War II and today, or even Tsarist Russia and today, is that kind of intent of wanting to re-establish spheres of influence or sort of regain control, even if it's via puppet governments of former territories that maybe the Soviet Union held.
Well, and also there's that sense, isn't there, that some people say it's a mistake to think of Putin as wanting to re-establish the Soviet sphere of influence. He is going full Peter the Great. He's going all the way back to.
It's almost like an amalgamation of both eras, almost, in the way that they will work. But obviously, the main kind of talking point from the Russian side is that they want to minimize the direct border with NATO and halt NATO expansion.
And again, this takes us back to the 19th century, Russia versus Sweden, Finland being this funny kind of.
Which is also then the irony then comes out of, well, they were trying to shorten the NATO border, but then they've inadvertently freaked out Sweden and Finland enough to then join NATO, creating another couple thousand miles of direct border with NATO.
Total counterintuitive.
Which is more strategic in a lot of ways, because a lot of Russia's nuclear aviation capacity is in the kind of Murmansk northern region of Russia, which is not that far away from Finland. And there's not very many sort of kind of like infrastructure development in that region. It's kind of a couple of railways or whatever. But you would sort of think, like, strategically that's a silly thing to have done. And we can obviously dive more into NATO and the geopolitics of
I think the early history of NATO might be an interesting topic for another day, and the extent to which Russia is kind of frozen out of that to an extent. Although, as you were telling me before, it's largely because of Russian actions that Russia is frozen out of NATO.
Well, it's kind of like why are you afraid of us? Well, maybe keep on invading us.
And that's kind of the seed. I mean, it goes back a lot further. Obviously.
It's a lot nuanced.
But you've got this St. Petersburg, Moscow kind of. Are we in Europe? Are we in Asia? Kind of thing. That goes back for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
But this moment in NATO is very much that kind of seed that we now see flowering in the most awful way of that kind of paranoia, that paranoid mindset that Russia has long had.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think that's like obviously as condensed of a history as we can kind of fit into one podcast episode. But I think that the main thing to kind of take from this is that we look at obviously the Axis and the Allies, and we look at it as a fight between two distinct ideologies or worldviews. But actually, when we look at World War II, the Soviets allied with the Allies because it was convenient to their cause. There was almost like uncomfortable agreements between the two to sort of be like, reluctantly we'll work together.
Well, and as soon as their mutual foe is out of the picture, they're straight at each other's throats, and that's the Cold War.
And with we look at the two factions, but actually you had the Allies, the Axis, and then the Comintern. Those are the three factions that were there. All had their own interests, their own goals and ambitions. But it's when we look at some more of these, like, I mean, obviously we'll dive into topics you're going to cover in the next couple episodes. But it's never as black and white as being aligned with one country. Finland was a very unique example. And everything they did throughout between World War One ending and the kind of like the concession of territory in 1944 was down to self-preservation. It was down to opportunism as well. We're not going to pretend that they didn't have ambition of their own to take more territory and expand. But it was all sort of from a self-interest perspective. They didn't sort of agree with Nazi policy on kind of like the Holocaust or things like that, and they resisted those things too. And I think that's where it's not as clear as people sometimes think it is. But I always think it's an incredible example. It's fascinating learning about.
Oh yeah, always. Well, I've really enjoyed hearing about it. I had absolutely no idea about any of this, so I'm thoroughly fascinated.
We're all about here.
I'm glad you went down the rabbit hole for me on that and brought out some interesting things. But anyway, that's a good place to wrap it up. I think.
I think so.
Before the camera wraps it up for us. So thank you for listening, and tune back in soon to hear my side of what we've been looking at this week.
Thank you very much.
The Nazis were watching on, intrigued, and they thought, this is rather interesting. Hitler will back the IRA if it can prove itself able to defeat the Brits.
Switzerland is like the neutral country of all neutral countries. So we kind of just see that word and think, well, they just sell it out.
The German and Japanese embassies both remain open in Ireland, which creates an obvious security threat. They have this phrase, England's difficulty is our opportunity. And this very much was the idea behind collaborating with the Nazis. In July of 1939, 2 U-boats are sent to Iceland to link up with Gestapo agents in Reykjavik and to go on to Ireland with funds and weapons. In mid-1940, Sean Russell, he's given 3 months of Abwehr training. He was wrapped in a swastika flag before being buried at sea.
We've also got that full kind of frontal assault, full-blown war aspect to it, and you've got the more shady sabotage kind of aspect to it, which is the same for all sides in the war as well. In every single